He's a professor at Harvard, and he had written a book that was more or less like this, saying that, and I think he would argue that in some ways President Obama is inhibited by at least President Obama's perception of what latitude he has in terms of his race in this country. By being black, that he still has to maintain this notion of that we're all ultimately on the same team. It's just that we have a different notion as to whether or not we should do a running play or a passing play. Randall Kennedy, I think it is.
Randall Kennedy, yeah. Randall Kennedy is the guy who first came up with the idea of reparation. I mean, he's fairly well,
Indeed.
He's fairly well known. That's one of those questions where I refer always back to the late Adam Clayton Powell, who once said, beware of Greeks bearing gifts and white men who understand the Negro.
Right.
I don't pretend to understand, or I would never pretend to try to explain the president's relationship to his own blackness in terms of how he does his job. I mean, I have no intellectual or cultural, ground on which to stand there. I wouldn't know what to base an opinion on.
But I mean, I guess
I mean, it would not surprise me if he felt his options limited because of that, given the nature of the opposition that he's seen since he won election the first time. I mean, you'd have to be blind.
Right. I mean, I guess that's my point, is that, you don't necessarily have, and nor do I necessarily have the cultural experience to understand or even begin to contemplate what pressures or limitations he feels on himself. But with that said, you and I both have a sense of how that message would be received, on how certain segments of our population would receive that message. Right. I mean,
right. Worcester,
Boston area.
I mean, one thing I do know is I'm fairly well versed in white people.
Right. Exactly.
In their many variations.
Right.
So,
and I think to a certain extent, this is where I vacillate, because I certainly, from my experience, particularly, growing up, the idea that people would be like, that black guy is really saying stuff that's not appropriate for him to say.
David Brooks said that last night on PBS, that the president hadn't earned the right to be snarky with Republicans. Are you kidding me? He's 6 years. He's 6 years late in being snarky with Republicans.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's just another.
He hasn't earned the right by David Brooks's to act like a president, despite being elected twice. They're tearing up the language to find synonyms for uppity because they don't want to use uppity.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, this has been such a there's so many different cross currents running into this, and I do think this was the coup de grace in terms of his State of the Unions, right? I mean, do you have that sense?
I would think so. Because I get that sense, barring incredible events over the next year.
Right.
I think barring some sort of international thing or something that happens here, or, good or bad. I think next year's State of the Union will be half valedictory and half handing off the baton to whoever it is that's running for the Democrats.
Indeed.
So yeah, I think this is the last chance for him to give a State of the Union speech as a State of the Union speech. And it's it was wonderfully timed given the economic news that's floating around, and it showed off this new persona he's adopted since last fall.
Right.
I mean, I remember when Bill Clinton got shellacked in the midterms. I mean, he led off his following State of the Union with the era of big government is over. That isn't what we heard last night. And this president took a real beating in the midterms. So, this was like you said, I think this is his last chance, as a State of the Union address to do that.
Charlie Pierce, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time today.